The news arrived on a Tuesday in an envelope so fine, it seemed an affront to the stained pine of Mrs. Reeve's rented table. The paper was thick as cream. The seal was a deep, unforgiving blue, impressed with a coronet she did not recognize. Edith simply stared. News was rarely good and never grand. Usually it was the butcher's bill, a complaint from her landlady about the damp in the scullery, or a letter from her late husband's cousin, inquiring with tedious politeness after her dwindling finances. This was different. This was an object from another world. She slipped the seal with the small knife she used for her mending. The handwriting within belonged to a bygone era, a spidery, elegant script full of sharp peaks and graceful loops, penned by a heart that had never known a single day of labor. Mrs. Reeve, it began without preamble. I am informed by my man of business in London that you are a gentlewoman of good sense and practical nature, lately widowed and seeking a situation. He speaks of your character in terms that for a lawyer verge on the effusive. I am in need of a companion. My health is variable. My disposition, I am told, is not. The country air here in Yorkshire is bracing. The society is non-existent, which I count as a blessing. My offer is £300 per annum with all lodging and board at my estate Westbourne. Your duties will be light. Your primary responsibility will be to endure me. There is the matter of my great-nephew, the Duke of Whitchurch, whose house this is. You will find him private. His seclusion is a matter of long establishment. It need not concern you. I require your services to commence at your earliest convenience. A coach will be arranged upon receipt of your acceptance. Hortense Dowager, Duchess of Whitchurch. Edith read the letter twice. £300. It was a fortune. It was independent security. It was the end of the cloying pity in the eyes of her relations and the constant grinding arithmetic of making her small widow's portion last. Westbourne. The Duke of Whitchurch. The name was a faint echo from a world she had only ever brushed against, a great title and old family. She remembered her husband Arthur, a physician whose practice had served the fringes of the aristocracy, mentioning the name once. The Whitchurch dukedom. A hero of the peninsula, they had called him years ago. Then nothing. The name had vanished from the papers and from the gossip her husband would sometimes bring home, like a strange, useless trinket, as if the man himself had ceased to exist. His seclusion is a matter of long establishment. The phrase was a masterpiece of aristocratic understatement. A door firmly closed. A warning. It meant gossip whispers and a deep, unspoken sorrow. Edith, whose own life had been carved by grief, was not afraid of it. What she did fear was poverty, the slow creeping erosion of her personhood into a state of dependency. She looked around the small, tidy room. Her books, Arthur's medical texts beside her own volumes of poetry, were neatly shelved. The chair she sat in was her own. The small writing desk her own. They were the last remnants of a life that had been full and then suddenly was not. Arthur had been a good, kind man. His death from a sudden fever had been a brutal amputation. It had left her with the competence of mind and a deep, aching void where the easy companionship of her marriage had once been. She was 28 years old and felt she had already lived a lifetime. A companion to a dowager. It was a respectable fate, a quiet shelving of a life not yet half lived, but the letter hinted at something more. The bracing air, the non-existent society, and the Duke. The secluded Duke. The sentence, meant to be a deterrent, was to Edith a strange sort of lure. A problem to be observed, if not solved. Her mind, trained by Arthur in the arts of diagnosis, of looking for the root cause beneath the symptom, was intrigued. She did not deliberate for long. Practicality was the bedrock of her nature. She took out a sheet of her own plain, respectable paper, dipped her pen, and wrote her acceptance. She informed the Dowager Duchess she could be ready to travel in a week. That week passed in a flurry of quiet activity. She settled her accounts, packed her few trunks, and sold the furniture she could not take with her. Saying goodbye to the familiar weight of Arthur's desk was the hardest part. It felt like a final severance. She stood in the empty room, the key in her hand, and felt a pang of pure fear. She was stepping off the edge of her known world. The coach that arrived was not merely a coach. It was a statement lacquered in a black so deep it seemed to drink the light with the ducal crest on the door. It was drawn by 4 perfectly matched grays. The world of Westbourne had reached out and claimed her. As she settled against the plush velvet squabs, the sheer unthinking luxury of it was disorienting. It was the kind of wealth that did not need to announce itself. It simply was. The journey north was long. England unrolled outside her window, the tidy fields of the south giving way to the starker, more dramatic beauty of the north. The roads grew worse, the hills steeper. Finally, after 3 days of travel, the coach turned off the main post road and onto a private drive. They passed through gates of magnificent wrought iron sagging on their hinges and green with lichen. The drive beyond was rutted. The great oaks and beeches that lined it grew too close, their branches tangling overhead to create a long green tunnel. The parkland on either side was beautiful, but wild, the grass overgrown bracken creeping in from the edges. It was a place of immense scale and immense neglect, holding its breath. Then the house appeared. Westbourne was not beautiful. It was magnificent. A vast, sprawling edifice of gray stone. Built over centuries, it commanded the landscape with a brooding dominance. Its multitude of windows stared out like blank eyes. Only a small section of the west wing showed any sign of life. The rest of the house was shuttered dark asleep, a house in mourning for itself. The coach pulled to a stop before the grand entrance, the horses' hooves echoing in the profound silence. A footman, his livery immaculate but aged, opened the door. As Edith stepped down, the great oak doors of the house swung open. A butler who looked as ancient and solid as the house itself stood waiting. "Welcome to Westbourne," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Her Grace the Dowager Duchess is expecting you." He led her inside. The scale of the entrance hall was breathtaking. It rose 2 stories to a coffered ceiling, from which a great dust-shrouded chandelier hung like a fossil. The air was cold still and smelled of stone beeswax and the faint, dry scent of disuse. Her footsteps and the butler's were the only sounds. It was quieter than a church, a mausoleum. They passed closed door after closed door while portraits of long-dead Bowhursts in ruffs, wigs, and armor watched her progress from the shadows. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy-weighted. Finally, the butler stopped and opened a set of double doors, announcing Mrs. Reeve to his lady. The room she entered was a shock. Where the rest of the house was dim and cold, this chamber was filled with light and warmth. A fire blazed in the hearth, and every surface was cluttered with books, needlework, porcelain figures, and pots of flowering plants. It was an island of defiant life in a sea of slumber. In the center of it all, in a high-backed wing chair, sat a woman who could only be the Dowager Duchess of Whitchurch. She was tiny, ancient, and dressed in a severe black silk that made the diamonds at her throat and on her gnarled fingers seem all the more brilliant. Her face was a fine web of wrinkles, but her eyes, a startling, intelligent blue, were very much alive. So the Dowager said, her voice crisp and clear, "You are Mrs. Reeve. You are younger than I expected. I am 28. "Your Grace," Edith replied, giving a small curtsy. "An excellent age, old enough to have sense, young enough not to be set in your ways. Sit down, child. The journey is a trial. You will take tea." It was not a question. The butler, who had been waiting silently, withdrew. Edith sat in the chair opposite the Dowager, her spine straight. She felt as though she were being assessed, weighed and measured. "My man of business described you as practical," the Dowager continued, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Are you?" "I believe so, Your Grace." "Good. I have no time for hysterics. And you are a physician's widow. Did you learn anything from your husband? Anything useful? I mean, not just how to bill his patients." The question was blunt, almost rude, but Edith found she did not mind. It was a relief after the careful, veiled condolences she had grown so tired of. I assisted him with his accounts and the running of his dispensary. I know a little of herbs and the preparation of tinctures, and I know how to listen." The Dowager gave a short, sharp nod as if Edith had passed a test. Listening, a lost art. Most people simply wait for their turn to speak. Tea arrived, brought by a nervous maid. The Dowager poured with a steady hand, the china rattling faintly. For a moment they sat in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the ticking of a clock. "Westbourne is not what it was," the Dowager said abruptly, staring into the fire. "This manor used to be the very heart of the county, full of music and laughter. Now," she trailed off, her mouth tightening, "now it sleeps, just like its master." She looked back at Edith. "My great-nephew, William the Duke. You might see him, or perhaps you won't. He keeps to his own wing and dines alone. He speaks to no one but his valet and his attorney, and to me when he must. I understand." "Your Grace," Edith said softly. The letter was quite clear. Was it? The Dowager's smile was thin without humor. "No, Mrs. Reeve, it was not. It was a polite fiction. The truth is never clear. It is a tangled, wretched thing. The truth is that a war I never understood stole the boy I knew, sending back a duke, a mere title in the shape of a man." The sheer intensity in the old woman's voice was startling. This was the real reason Edith was here. Not to read aloud or play piquet. She was a tool, a lever brought to pry open a door sealed for 10 years. Just then the drawing-room door opened. A man stood on the threshold. He was tall, with shoulders broader than the fashion dictated, dressed in a coat of black superfine, beautifully tailored, but severe. His thick dark brown hair was unruly, and his face was a study in harsh angles. A strong jaw, a straight nose, a hard mouth. It was a face that might have been handsome once, but was now merely formidable. His cool gray eyes swept the room and settled on Edith with a look of chilling distaste. Yet it was not his harsh face that held the eye. It was his left side. The sleeve of his coat was pinned flat against his chest. Where his arm should have been, there was nothing. He did not step inside. He simply stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame. His posture was a study in controlled tension. "Aunt," he said, his voice a low, cold baritone. "You have a visitor." "I have a new companion, William the Dowager," replied her tone sharpening. "This is Mrs. Reeve. Mrs. Reeve, may I present my great-nephew, His Grace the Duke of Whitchurch." Edith rose and gave a small curtsy. She kept her eyes on his face, avoiding his empty shoulder. It was a deliberate choice. She would not stare. The Duke gave a nod so slight it felt like an insult. His gaze did not linger. It was as if she were an unwelcome piece of furniture his aunt had acquired. "I trust she will be comfortable," he said to the empty air. "She will be," the Dowager snapped. "No thanks to the state of the guest wing," she added. "I have had rooms prepared for her here in this part of the house." A flicker of resentment crossed his face. "As you wish," he muttered. He did not say another word, simply turning and walking away. His footsteps faded down the long, silent corridor, leaving an emptiness more potent than his presence. Edith sat down slowly, her heart hammering. She had seen him now, the recluse, the wounded hero, and she had seen in his eyes not sorrow, but a deep, cold, bottomless rage. The Dowager sighed a long, weary sound. "Well," she said, her voice suddenly tired, "now you know. That is the Duke of Whitchurch, and that Mrs. Reeve is the peace of Westbourne." The first weeks passed in a strange, quiet rhythm. Edith's duties were as promised light. She read the papers in the morning, wrote letters in the afternoon, and spent the evenings in companionable silence or quiet conversation. Lady Hortense was sharp, opinionated, and fiercely intelligent. She spoke endlessly of politics, literature, and her youth in a glittering, long-dead court. Slowly, Edith mapped the geography of Westbourne, a house deeply divided. The west wing, where she and the Dowager lived, was kept clean and warm, a small habitable island. The rest of the house, with its grand staterooms and endless corridors, lay shrouded in dust sheets and silence. Then there was the north wing, the Duke's domain. It was his fortress, his sanctuary, and his prison. No one went there except his valet Fletcher, a grim-faced man who had served with him in the war. She caught only rare glimpses of the Duke crossing the overgrown lawns, striding with two large hounds at his heels, or appearing briefly at the Dowager's door to ask a clipped question. If their eyes met, he gave nothing but a stiff, formal nod. He was a ghost in his own house, a palpable absence. But Edith was not one to sit idle. Her practical nature demanded an outlet. With the Dowager's amused permission, she began to bring order to the chaos. She started with the neglected household accounts. Spending long days in a small, cold office off the main hall, her neat handwriting brought order to the messy ledgers of the elderly steward. She discovered the estate was bleeding money, not from theft but sheer inattention. Double-paid bills, uncollected rents, and forgotten repairs. It was the finance of pure apathy. She drew up a fresh, simple ledger for the Dowager. "Good heavens, child," the old lady said, squinting at the neat columns through her lorgnette. "You have a remarkable mind for figures." "I thought that was a male complaint," she added. "Order is a comfort, Your Grace," Edith replied simply. "Is it, or is it a weapon against chaos?" the Dowager asked shrewdly. Edith offered no answer. Her next project was the still room abandoned for years to cobwebs and dust. She had it scrubbed from top to bottom. She found the old herb garden behind a high brick wall, spending hours in gloves weeding, until she resurrected a few tough, fragrant survivors, lavender, rosemary, thyme. She dried them for linen sachets and made simple infusions for the Dowager's herbal teas. The physical work was grounding, settling her mind. But her greatest discovery of all was the library. It was a magnificent room 2 stories high with soaring arched windows looking out over the wild park. Bookshelves climbed to the ceiling, reached by a tall, rolling ladder. Yet like everything else, it had fallen into gentle decay. Dust lay thick over everything. The leather bindings were dry and cracked, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and neglect. It was the only room outside his own wing that the Duke ever visited. Edith would sometimes see a lamp burning there late at night, yet he did nothing to halt its decline. He used the room but did not care for it. She decided the library would be her domain. Beginning one shelf at a time, she took on the monumental task of cataloging the collection, dusting each volume, checking the bindings, and logging every title in a fresh ledger. The slow, methodical work soothed her. She loved the feel of the old books, the quiet whisper of the pages, and the history held within them. One afternoon, while she was halfway up the rolling ladder, he found her. He entered so quietly, she never heard him. Reaching for a heavy volume of Plutarch, she suddenly felt a shift in the air, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. She looked down. The Duke of Whitchurch stood at the base of the ladder, looking up with cool, unreadable gray eyes. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice carrying an accusation, not curiosity. "I am cataloging the books, Your Grace," Edith replied, keeping her voice steady. She did not climb down. To descend would feel too much like a retreat. "Why?" he asked. "Because they need care." She said some of the bindings require repair, and without a catalog there is no way to know what is here. He gestured vaguely at the thousands of volumes around them. "It is a futile exercise," he muttered. "Most of these have not been opened in a century." Edith looked from the book in her hands to his face, noting the rigid tension in his posture. He looked like a man braced for a blow that had already fallen. "Order is never futile, Your Grace," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "It is a form of peace." The words hung in the dusty, sunlit air. She braced for a sharp dismissal, but instead he remained silent. He looked away, his gaze sweeping over the chaotic shelves as if seeing them for the very first time. For a long, stretched moment he said nothing. A muscle worked in his jaw. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the library, his boots echoing on the polished floor. Edith remained on the ladder, her heart pounding. It was the longest conversation they had ever shared. and in it she had seen the first tiny crack in the fortress of his solitude. She looked down at the heavy book in her hands. It suddenly felt less like a chore and more like a beginning. Let's take a very brief break, and if you want to catch our latest stories, be sure to subscribe to the channel. That small moment in the library did not bring any sudden change. The Duke did not seek her out, nor did he visit his aunt's drawing room. The vast, silent manor remained in its sleeping state, yet something had subtly shifted. When they passed now, his quiet nod was no longer an insult, but a neutral fact. When he passed her in the corridor, his cool gray eyes would lock onto hers for a mere fraction of a second, before drifting away. He was fully aware of her. Like an observer in his own quiet wilderness, he had noted a rare new species. Edith simply continued her work. The library became her sanctuary. She learned the physical feel of the room, the way afternoon light stretched across the floor, and that the Duke preferred reading history and military strategy. He would take a book from a shelf and leave it on a reading table, a silent message that he had been there. She would find it, note the title, and return it to its shelf. It was a strange, wordless partnership in the care of these books. Soon she began to notice the small daily struggles his injury caused him. She saw the faint tremor of frustration in his right hand whenever he tried to handle a massive, awkward folio. She saw how he angled his body to shield his left side, a constant, unconscious shield. She watched his valet Fletcher anticipate his every need by opening doors, placing glasses just so, and even cutting his meat before serving it. The Duke's entire life was a carefully built routine designed to avoid the humiliation of needing help. Edith never offered to assist him. Pity, she knew, would be an unforgivable insult. Pity meant seeing only the injury, the absence. Her late husband, Arthur, had always taught her that a doctor's greatest tool was not sympathy, but clear-eyed observation, seeing the whole person rather than just the ailment. So, instead of offering help, she made tiny silent adjustments. She found a heavy wrought-iron bookstand in a dusty corner, had it polished, and left it near his favorite reading chair. It was an old design that held a volume open with weighted page holders, allowing it to be read with a single hand. She never spoke of it. She simply left it. A week later, she saw him using it. His long fingers rested on the page. He did not look up, but she felt his awareness. Later, when the Dowager asked for a book of architectural drawings from a high cabinet, Edith made sure to position the rolling ladder on the right side so it could be climbed and held with a strong right hand. These were tiny, almost invisible acts of consideration. Competence, not coddling. She was reshaping his world to fit him rather than asking him to struggle against a world made for two hands. Then one rainy afternoon in late autumn, a crisis arose. It was a small domestic problem, but at Westbourne it felt like a disaster. A message arrived from a tenant farmer named Hobbs. His cottage roof was leaking so badly that a bedroom was entirely unusable. His wife was expecting a child, making the cold damp a genuine danger. The elderly steward Dawson, who was long past his prime, had simply dismissed the farmer's concerns. When the Dowager heard about this from a distraught housemaid whose sister was married to Hobbs, she was incensed. She declared that Dawson was a fool, and her nephew was blind for paying a man to manage the estate while assuming everything was fine. She insisted this could not stand, telling Edith to go speak to William. Edith's heart sank. "Me, your grace." "Yes, you," the Dowager replied. Edith protested that he would think she was meddling, but the Dowager argued that Edith had a practical head. She would present it not as a tragedy, but as a problem of logistics. Go. Armed with a reluctant sense of duty, Edith made her way toward the north wing. This was territory she had never entered. The corridor grew colder, the air completely still. She felt like an intruder. She found the Duke not in his private study, but in a small, stark room containing little more than a workbench, some maps, and several polished pieces of disassembled clockwork. He was bent over the intricate mechanism, a jeweler's loop in his right eye, his single hand moving with surprising dexterity among the tiny cogs. He did not seem surprised to see her. He straightened, removing the loop, and addressed her as Mrs. Reeve. She apologized for the intrusion, then explained the situation with the Hobbs cottage, keeping her tone calm and factual. She detailed the leak, the damp, and the impending birth. She did not embellish or speak of suffering. Instead, she spoke of water ingress and compromised timbers. He listened, his expression hardening. He asked if Dawson had been informed, and she replied it had been 2 weeks ago. He remarked coldly that the man did nothing, adding that the steward was past his prime and would be dismissed. Edith pressed gently, asking about the roof, noting that dismissing the steward would not keep the Hobbs family dry tonight. He gave her a sharp look, saying he was aware of that and would send men tomorrow. Edith apologized, but pointed out that more rain was forecast, making tomorrow too late to prevent costlier damage. She held out a sheet of paper she had prepared. She explained she had looked at the accounts and found a reliable village builder, Mr. Ames. She had already estimated the cost of timber slate and 2 days of labor. While not a small sum, she noted it was cheaper than rebuilding a collapsed roof and treating a child for lung fever. He took the paper from her. His hand was steady, his fingers long and elegant. He studied her neat figures, his brow furrowing in concentration as silence stretched through the cold room. He was being challenged not on his authority, but on his practicality. She had brought him a solution, not a problem. Finally, he looked up. His gray eyes were assessing, not angry. He murmured that she thought of everything, to which she replied, she only tried to think of what was necessary. Quiet for a moment, he gestured to the half-repaired clock, calling the room his penance, an exercise in frustration to train one hand to do the work of two. He explained it required patience, method, and an understanding of mechanics. Looking back down at the paper she had given him, he remarked that she had approached the estate's problem in the very same way. Walking to the door, he called for Fletcher. The valet appeared instantly. He instructed Fletcher to take a note to Dawson, ordering him to pay a voucher to Mr. Ames for the immediate repair of the cottage roof, not to exceed the estimate. He handed Fletcher the paper, adding that a cart with dry firewood and blankets must go to the farm at once. Fletcher nodded and vanished. The Duke turned back to Edith, cutting a formidable figure in the dim light. He asked why she had come with a ledger and a solution rather than simply wringing her hands over the plight of the poor. Edith chose her words carefully. Charity was for the poor, but a leaking roof on his property was a matter of responsible management. They were not the same. A strange expression crossed his face. It was the ghost of a smile, a flicker of something that was not bitterness. He murmured slowly that he supposed they were not. He held her gaze for a beat longer. In that moment she felt he was truly seeing her for the first time, not as his aunt's companion, but as an equal in mind, if not in rank. Softly he thanked her, addressing her as Mrs. Reeve. His quiet words landed with the weight of a pronouncement. She inclined her head, bidding him good day. Walking back down the cold corridor toward the warmth of the west wing, she felt a triumph entirely out of proportion to a repaired roof. She had met the Duke on his own ground of logic, competence, and control. He had not dismissed her. He had listened. Later that evening, the Dowager looked at Edith over the rim of her teacup, noting she heard the roof was being mended. She asked if he had bitten Edith's head off. Edith replied he had been reasonable. Reasonable, the old lady snorted, declaring William had not been reasonable in a decade. He had been barricaded, and there was a difference. She set her cup down, her blue eyes sharp and knowing. She told Edith she was good for him, because she did not treat him like a broken thing. Edith felt a warmth spread through her chest, admitting she saw a man who had endured a great deal, but she did not pity him. The Dowager agreed with venom, calling pity a useless, corrosive emotion, an insult dressed as kindness. She insisted William did not need pity, but a reason. A reason to come out of the dark. She looked at Edith with an expression both hopeful and deeply sad, whispering that as an old woman she had feared he would never find one. That night, for the first time, Edith allowed herself to think of the Duke, not as a problem to be managed, but as William, a man trapped, not by the loss of his arm, but by the loss of his world. And she, in her own quiet, practical way, was standing at the edge of his world holding a candle. She did not know if he would ever choose to walk toward the light, but for the first time, she felt the possibility. A fragile, tentative hope settled over the sleeping house. From his window, William Bowhurst, the Duke of Whitchurch, watched her. It was a habit now, standing in the shadows of his study, looking out over the west lawn, watching Mrs. Reeve walk in the gardens. She moved with a calm, purposeful stride, never wandering aimlessly. She might pause to examine a struggling rosebush or pull a stubborn weed with quiet efficiency. Meanwhile, he had spent the better part of 10 years cultivating a state of perfect, unbreachable solitude. He had built walls of silence and duty reinforced by rigid routine. His world was small, controlled, and safe. He had his books, his maps, his ticking clocks. He had Fletcher, who understood everything without a single word. He had his aunt, a familiar, welcome irritant. It was enough. It had to be enough. Then Mrs. Reeve arrived. He had resented her presence at first, a sudden intrusion, a new piece on a chessboard he had long since mastered. He had expected a nervous, fragile creature who would flutter at his presence, her eyes darting to his empty sleeve with that sickening mix of horror and pity. But Edith Reeve did not flutter. She was still calm, and she did not look at his missing arm. She looked at his face. Her gaze was direct, intelligent, and unnervingly clear. It felt like being touched by sunlight after a decade in a dark cave. He found himself thinking of her at odd moments, the way she had stood on the library ladder, surrounded by chaos, speaking of order as a form of peace. She had presented the problem of a tenant's leaking roof, not as a plea for mercy, but as a failure of logistics. She did not appeal to his heart. She targeted his intellect. It was this that disarmed him. For 10 years, people had tried to get at his heart. His aunt, with her sharp-tongued affection, his solicitor, speaking of ducal duty, and the few old friends who had tried to breach his walls, they had all come with hammers of sentiment and sympathy. Mrs. Reeve came with the key, one forged of logic and quiet competence. He replayed their conversation in his workshop over and over. He had told her that room was his penance, something he had never admitted to another soul, not even Fletcher. The words had simply slipped out. Why? Because she had not looked at the delicate, half-finished clockwork as a strange, eccentric hobby. She had looked at the mechanisms he sensed and understood them for what they were. A discipline, a quiet battle against the clumsiness of a broken world. One morning he sat in the estate office with Dawson, the elderly steward, he still could not bring himself to dismiss. The old man was flustered, his papers in a hopeless muddle, struggling to explain a discrepancy in the accounts for the home farm. William's patience, always a thin resource, was wearing out. The numbers swam before his eyes, proof of pure incompetence. The door opened, and Mrs. Reeve entered, pausing to take in the scene. She apologized, explaining she was looking for the seed receipts from last spring. Dawson shuffled his papers miserably, promising to find them. As she stepped further into the room, her very presence seemed to suck the panic right out of the air. She offered to assist, mentioning she had seen them while sorting the correspondence from March. She moved to a large, cluttered cabinet. Her hands were deft and certain. She did not rummage. She seemed to know exactly where everything was. After a moment, she pulled out a thin folder and placed the papers on the desk. Then her eyes fell on the ledger Dawson and William had been struggling to decipher. She noted softly that these were the dairy accounts, pointing her finger at a column of figures. The error was right there. The revenue from selling cheese to the local inn had been entered third as an expense. William looked closer. She was absolutely right. It was a simple, foolish mistake that had thrown the entire balance off. Dawson stared at the page, his mouth open in surprise, while William looked at Edith. She had seen the problem instantly. Not just the mismatched numbers, but the fog of frustration in the room. She had fixed it without any fuss. He thanked her, though the words felt entirely inadequate. She replied it was nothing, gave a small nod, and left the office, closing the door quietly. Dawson let out a long breath, murmuring that she was indeed a remarkable woman. A sharp mind, yet gentle with it. William said nothing, staring down at the corrected ledger. A sharp mind, yes, but it was more than that. It was the quiet way she moved through his world, never demanding a place but simply making everything better, tidier, more logical, calmer. Soon he found himself making excuses just to cross her path. He would go to the library when he knew she would be working, pretending to look for a book, but really just wanting to be near her. They rarely spoke, yet the silence in the room when she was there was entirely different from when he was alone. His was a hollow silence. Theirs was a shared quiet, a true peace. Then one afternoon he found her in the walled garden. She was kneeling, her skirts protected by a rough apron, patiently clearing a flower bed that had been choked with weeds for years. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, a small smudge of dirt on her cheek. He stopped a few feet away. His hounds, usually hostile to strangers, sat quietly by his side, watching her with placid interest. She looked up, startled, a sudden flush rising in her cheeks as she began to stand. He told her not to stop on his account, his voice sounding sharper than he intended. She settled back on her heels, hands resting on the trowel in her lap, explaining she was trying to see if the old rose varieties could be saved. His grandmother's roses, he murmured. He had not thought of them in years, but now he remembered his grandmother, a woman much like his Aunt Hortense, tending these very beds. It was a memory from another life, a life with 2 hands before the war. Edith noted that some of the plants were still strong, they just needed light and air. The simple phrase struck him with the weight of a physical blow. He looked from the tangled, struggling rosebush to her face, lit by the pale afternoon sun. Looking at her capable, soil-stained hands, he realized she was not just talking about roses. Could the tangled, overgrown wilderness of his own life be reclaimed with something as basic as light and air? He admitted his grandmother had been a great gardener, believing anything could be brought back to life with enough patience. Edith replied softly that she sounded like a wise woman. They fell silent. The only sounds were the call of a rook in the high branches of a beech tree and the distant bleating of sheep. It was not an awkward silence, but a moment of profound, unspoken understanding. He was the Duke of Whitchurch, master of this vast, decaying estate. She was a paid companion, a widow with no fortune. Yet in this forgotten garden they were simply a man and a woman looking at a broken thing and seeing the possibility of life. He felt a sudden, sharp desire to tell her everything, to explain the cold rage that had been his only companion for a decade. He wanted to tell her about the flash, the deafening noise, and the shocking absence where his arm had been. To describe the phantom limb that burned with a pain no one else could see. To confess the deep, abiding shame of his own survival when so many others had died. But the habit of silence was too strong. Instead, he told her it was growing cold and she should go inside, though his eyes still burned with the torrent of unspoken words. Her expression was one of deep, quiet compassion, but it was not pity. He knew the difference now. Pity looked down, whereas her eyes held a shared humanity. She agreed softly, gathering her tools. He watched her walk back toward the grand house, her posture straight and her step perfectly even. He remained in the garden for a long time, the cool air brushing his face, while his dogs rested their heads on his knees. For the first time in 10 years, the silence of Westbourne did not feel like a comfort. It felt like a cage, and he was suddenly desperately aware of the key. Then the first snow of winter fell in early December. A soft, thick blanket transformed the wild parkland of Westbourne into a place of stark, silent beauty. The house grew quieter, hunkered down against the bitter cold. The world shrank to the fireside, lamplit rooms, and long, dark corridors. In this compressed world, the presence of Edith Reeve grew even more potent, a steady, quiet flame in the gloom. The west wing under her gentle care, and with a smoothness it had not known in years. The servants, once listless and cowed, began to take pride in their work again. There was a new polish on the silver, a fresh scent of beeswax in the halls. These were small changes, but they were not insignificant. They were the signs of a house beginning to breathe once more. William soon found himself planning his days to intersect with hers, taking walks on the terrace, when she took the air, or visiting the library while she worked. These were not assignations, but quiet observations. He was studying her, trying to understand the nature of her deep calm. Slowly he learned to read the subtle signs of her moods, a slight tension in her shoulders when she was tired, a thoughtful frown when wrestling with figures, or the rare, lovely curve of her lips when one of the Dowager's sharp stories amused her. Having spent 10 years studying only his own private grief, he was now learning to observe another. The Dowager watched them with her shrewd, knowing eyes. For once, she held her tongue. She knew this fragile connection could shatter with a single misplaced word, so she simply kept bringing them together. Her mind remained as sharp and calculating as ever. The catalyst for the next great shift arrived as a letter. This was no quiet personal note, but a thick, formal invitation from Larchwood Park, the grandest house in the neighborhood and seat of Sir John and Lady Ashworth. It was for their annual Christmas assembly. Invitations to Westbourne were rare. For years the county respected the Duke's seclusion, or perhaps they had simply grown tired of his constant refusals. But the Ashworths were new to the county, wealthy from trade and eager to establish themselves. Perhaps they were ignorant of his habits or simply audacious enough to ignore them. The Dowager held the letter high like a battle standard. "They have invited us, the Duke of Whitchurch, the Dowager Duchess, and a guest." Her eyes glittered. "That means you, Edith." William, summoned to his aunt's drawing room, stood stiffly by the fireplace. "You will send our regrets, of course." The Dowager retorted that she would do no such thing. "We are going. I do not go to assemblies." His voice was flat, final. "You do not." His aunt agreed. "And as a result, the county believes you are either mad dying or both. Your cousin Quincy is spreading rumors that you are no longer competent to manage your affairs. He suggests a regency with himself as regent naturally." A muscle jumped in William's jaw. Quincy Bowhurst was his heir presumptive, a man whose ambition was matched only by his lack of scruple. "Quincy is a fool," William muttered. "He is a dangerous fool," his aunt countered. "And you gave him ammunition by hiding for 10 years. People will believe him. It is time you reminded them who the Duke of Whitchurch is. We will go, and you will be seen. It is your duty." "I have done my duty," William said, his voice dangerously low as he touched his empty sleeve. "I did my duty for king and country. I will not be paraded like a freak for the entertainment of the local gentry." The room fell silent. The word hung in the air. Freak. It was the secret, ugly word he had lived with for 10 years, the word written in averted eyes and sudden silences. Edith, sitting quietly by the window with her needlework, felt her heart tighten. She looked at his rigid posture, the raw pain in his gray eyes. It was the first time he had ever named the monster haunting him. The Dowager's face softened, the fight leaving her. "William," she began with rare gentle sorrow, but he did not want her pity. He turned on his heel, ordered her to send the regrets, and strode out. The Dowager sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I push him too hard," she murmured. "But if he does not fight, men like Quincy will devour this estate. They will pick it clean." She looked at Edith, her eyes pleading. "He will not listen to me." Later that day, Edith found him where she knew he would be. The ballroom. It was a vast, cold space, its parquet floors covered in dust, its gilded mirrors tarnished, and its chandeliers shrouded like sleeping ghosts. The grand room had not been used since before the war. This was the heart of the house's grief. He stood in the center of the room in the fading light, staring at his faint reflection in a dusty mirror. A dark, solitary figure surrounded by quiet ghosts. Edith made no sound as she approached, stopping a few feet behind him. "Your Grace," she said softly. He did not turn. "If you have come to lecture me on duty, Mrs. Reeve, save your breath. I have had enough of duty today. I have not come to speak of duty," she said, "but of courage." That made him turn to face her, wary and guarded. "What would you know of courage?" "I know there are different kinds," she replied, her gaze direct. There is the courage of the battlefield of facing fire and steel. I have heard of your bravery. You have that kind in abundance. She took a step closer, the space between them suddenly tense. But there is another kind of courage. The courage of the everyday, to face a room full of whispers, to endure the stares, and to live in a world that is no longer built for you. And there is the courage to simply be seen as you are. He stared, his face a mask of stone, though his eyes betrayed his inner turmoil. She was naming the fears he had never dared speak aloud. They say you were a soldier. Your Grace, she continued, her voice dropping lower. A soldier's courage is more than one heroic act that earns a medal. Sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is to come home, to walk back into the world. Your aunt is wrong. You should not go to this ball for duty or to spite your cousin. Go for yourself, to show them and yourself that you are still here. She paused, letting her words settle in the silence. I am not asking you to dance or to make polite conversation. Just stand in that room and let them look. Their whispers cannot hurt you, and their pity cannot touch you. You are the Duke of Whitchurch, and you are far more than your injury. It is time you remembered that. She had said her piece, laying out her argument with clear logic, just as she had with the leaking roof. But this was not about timber. This was about his soul. He did not answer. He stood there, his single hand clenched into a fist, staring at her as if she were a puzzle he could not solve. A strange, unexpected light in his dark life. Edith held his gaze for a second. Then she nodded and walked away, leaving him alone in the gathering dark of the empty ballroom. She did not know if she had succeeded, but she had found the courage to speak the truth to a man wrapped in silence. Now the choice was his. The night of the Ashworth's assembly arrived cold and clear, with stars like chips of ice in the black sky. Edith had no idea if the Duke would go. There had been no word, no sign. An hour before departure, she sat in the drawing room wearing a simple gown of deep gray silk she had owned for years. The Dowager sat resplendent in purple velvet and diamonds, her expression grim. The carriage was waiting, but the Duke was nowhere to be seen. He is not coming, the Dowager said, her voice flat with disappointment. I was a fool to hope. At that moment the door opened. Fletcher stood on the threshold. His Grace is ready, my lady. And, behind him, William appeared. He wore immaculate evening attire, a coat of the deepest black wool, a white silk waistcoat, and a cravat, tied with stark precision. The contrast made him look taller and more formidable than ever. His dark hair was brushed back, his jaw set, and his cool gray eyes shadowed. His empty sleeve was pinned with his usual neatness. He looked like a brooding lord emerging from his tower, terrifying and magnificent. He did not look at Edith, addressing only his aunt. The carriage is waiting. We should not be late. The Dowager's face showed brief astonishment before her composure returned. Of course, William, she replied. The journey to Larchwood Park was made in near total silence. The Dowager seemed too afraid to break the spell. William stared out into the dark, his face unreadable, while Edith sat opposite him with her hands clasped tightly. She felt a mix of anxiety and pride. He had actually come. Larchwood Park was a blaze of light and music carriages lining the drive. It was everything Westbourne was not, loud, alive, and glittering. Stepping out of the carriage, Edith felt a sudden wave of fear. This was the world she had asked him to face. William was pale, but his expression was resolute, wearing his title like a suit of armor. Their entrance into the ballroom caused an instant sensation. A wave of silence rippled from the door, followed by a rising tide of whispers. Every head turned. Every eye fixed on the Duke of Whitchurch, the legendary recluse, returned from the dead. They stared at his face, his severe black coat, and his empty sleeve. William stood on the threshold, his gaze sweeping the room like a cold mask of aristocratic pride. He seemed to see no one. He offered his right arm to his aunt. She placed her hand upon it, and together they stepped forward. Edith walked a step behind a quiet gray shadow in their wake. It felt exactly like entering a battlefield. The hushed whispers flew like arrows. "Good God," they hissed, "it is him. I never expected to see him again. Look at his arm, the poor man. They say he is not right in the head." But William gave no sign of hearing. He cut through the crowd like parting water, his face completely frozen. Leading his aunt to a pair of chairs near the patronesses, he seated her, then stood at her side, a grim, solitary sentinel. Nobody approached him. People stared and whispered, yet they kept their distance, as if he stood behind an invisible wall of ice. Edith remained by his side, unsure of what else to do. She felt those hostile stares as keenly as he did, the suffocating weight of 100 pairs of eyes. She lifted her chin, determined to be part of his wall. She would stand with him and meet their gazes with quiet dignity. Sir John and Lady Ashworth bustled over wearing triumphant smiles. They had snared the county's greatest prize. Lady Ashworth gushed, calling it an honor, and saying they were delighted by his presence. Lady Ashworth. William said, his voice clipped and cold. He gave a stiff bow. The conversation was agonizingly awkward. The Ashworths tried hard to draw him out, but his replies were short, his demeanor glacial. After a few painful minutes, they retreated, thoroughly flustered. The evening wore on. Music played, couples swirled across the dance floor, yet William remained by his aunt's chair entirely unmoving. A few brave gentlemen, old friends of his father, approached to pay their respects. He received them with cold civility, keeping his answers brief and formal. No one dared ask him to dance. The very idea was unthinkable. He was a monument, not a man, a relic of a war everyone else wanted to forget. Edith felt a rising tide of anger on his behalf. These people with their easy lives and careless whispers, what did they know of his suffering? They saw a broken duke. She saw a man of immense, tightly controlled strength. Then her eyes found Quincy Bowhurst across the room. He was holding court, a smug, satisfied look plastered on his handsome face. He watched them and smiled, clearly enjoying William's discomfort as proof of his own cruel predictions. In that moment, something inside Edith snapped. A quiet, determined resolve took hold. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and the floor filled with color and movement. William stood like a rock in a churning sea, his gaze fixed on some distant point over the heads of the dancers. Edith moved. She took the 2 steps separating them and stood before him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He looked down, his gray eyes questioning, a flicker of surprise in their cool depths. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was low for his ears only, but clear and steady. "You told me once you could no longer dance." His expression tightened. He thought she was about to commit the ultimate cruelty, to ask the impossible of him. "You did not say," she continued, softly holding his gaze, "that you could no longer stand on a dance floor with a friend." She did not offer him her hand, nor did she gesture to the floor. She simply stood before him, her eyes filled with a trust and understanding that went far beyond words. She was not asking him to pretend to be whole. Instead, she was inviting him to be himself with her in full view of the world. It was an act of breathtaking audacity. He stared at her. The noise of the ballroom, the music, and the whispers all faded away. There was only her face and her calm, courageous eyes. A friend. The word resonated in the silent, lonely chambers of his heart. For 10 years he had been defined by what he could not do. He could not tie his own cravat. He could not cut his own meat. He could not write without smudging the ink. He could not dance. Yet she had not asked him what he could do. She had simply offered her presence, a place to stand. Slowly, deliberately, he gave a single stiff nod. He did not offer her his arm. He simply turned and walked toward the crowded dance floor. Edith fell into step beside him. They moved through the fringe of onlookers who stared, mouths agape. They walked to the very edge of the swirling mass of dancers and stopped. He stood straight and tall, his hand resting on the hilt of a dress sword he was not wearing. Edith stood beside him, her hands clasped loosely. They did not speak or touch. They simply stood together, two quiet figures on the edge of the maelstrom, while the waltz soared around them. It was the most scandalous thing to happen in the county, in a decade more shocking than a duel, more intimate than a stolen kiss in the conservatory. The Duke of Whitchurch and the unknown woman in grey standing still while the world danced. The whispers died. The stares were no longer born of pity or morbid curiosity. They were filled with astonishment, with awe. Everyone watched something they could not understand, but whose power they could not deny. Edith looked at William's profile. His face remained a mask, but the tension in his jaw had eased and his shoulders were slightly less rigid. He was breathing. He was present. He had walked back into the world, and he was not alone. The music swelled to its crescendo, then faded into polite applause. In the quiet that followed, William turned his head and looked at her. Really looked. It was a gaze of gratitude, so profound, it needed no words. And for the very first time, she saw the ghost of a real smile touch his mouth. It was the barest flicker of a thing, but it was there. It was a beginning. The drive back to Westbourne was as silent as the journey out, but the quality of that silence had entirely changed. It was no longer tense or apprehensive. It was deep, resonant, and peaceful, a silence of shared experience. When they arrived, the Dowager pleaded fatigue and retired almost immediately, but not before giving Edith's hand a sharp, meaningful squeeze. William walked with Edith to the door of his aunt's drawing room. "Mrs. Reeve," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet hall. "Your Grace." "Thank you." It was only 2 words, but they held an inter-world of meaning. "There is no need for thanks, Your Grace," she replied softly. "I was glad to stand with my friend." She used the word again deliberately and saw something shift in his eyes, a lowering of the guard. "Edith," he said, her given name sounding strange and wonderful on his lips. "My name is William." Her heart gave a sudden lurch. This was another threshold crossed, another door unlocked. "William," she repeated. It felt completely right. He gave her that same infinitesimal nod he had given her on the dance floor. "Good night." "Good night, William." She went into the drawing room and stood by the dying fire, her hand pressed to her chest. She had gone to the ball, expecting to be a shield. She had not expected to find a friend, nor had she expected to hear him say her name. The great sleeping house of Westbourne felt for the first time full of quiet, thrilling possibility. By the morning after the assembly, the atmosphere at Westbourne was irrevocably altered. The spell of inertia had broken. It was as if a window had been thrown open in a sealed room, letting in a draft of fresh, clean air. William began to emerge from his private wing. He took his breakfast not in his solitary dining room, but in the small morning room adjoining the Dowager's suite. At first he would simply sit with the paper, speaking very little, but he was there. His presence was a new fact in the household's daily equation. He started walking the estate with a new purpose, not just for exercise with his dogs, but with the keen eye of a master. He had long, difficult conversations with Dawson, the steward. A week after the ball, the old man was retired with a generous pension, and a younger, more vigorous man was hired from an estate in the next county. William involved Edith in his plans, unrolling maps on the library table and asking for her opinion. Not on matters of architecture or agriculture, since he was the expert there, but on the human side of the estate. Which tenants were reliable, which families were struggling. She had, in her quiet way, learned more about the people of Westbourne in a few months than he had in 10 years. "You are my eyes and ears, Edith," he told her one afternoon as they looked over plans to repair a row of village cottages. "I have been blind for too long." Their conversations were rarely personal. They spoke of drainage, crop rotation, roof timbers, and rents, but beneath the practical surface a much deeper conversation was taking place. They were learning the rhythms of each other's minds. She learned to appreciate his sharp, logical intellect, a deep-rooted sense of responsibility buried under years of pain and anger. Meanwhile, he learned to rely on her calm judgment, her quiet empathy, and her unerring sense of what was right. The library became their shared office, their sanctuary. The work of cataloging continued, but now they often did it together. He would sit at the table, his single hand moving with slow precision as he made notes while she stood on the ladder calling down book titles. The air was filled with the quiet sounds of their labor, the rustle of paper, the scrape of a chair, the low murmur of their voices. It was a kind of domesticity far more intimate than any drawing-room flirtation. One day, he came into the library to find her struggling to lift a heavy box of books from a high shelf. "Allow me," he said, moving quickly to her side. Before she could protest, he reached up with his right arm, the muscles in his shoulder and back bunching with the effort. For a moment, she feared the box was too awkward. But he found his balanced jaw, tight eyes fixed, and lowered it slowly to the floor. He stood there, chest heaving, slightly, sweat dampening his brow. He kept his eyes down. It was the embarrassment of effort, of exposing his own physical limits. Edith offered no pity, no polite fuss. She simply noted that the folio editions of Dryden would always be heavy. She made it a dry, practical matter, sparing him any dramatic display of sympathy. His gaze rose to meet her, filled with a sudden, quiet relief. She understood. She always did. Where others saw a painful struggle, she saw only a task finished. As winter slowly softened into spring, William began to change. The sharp, bitter lines of his face started to ease. That cold glare of his was replaced more and more by a quiet, thoughtful stillness. He still found smiles difficult, but that faint trace she had caught at the ball showed up more often. Slowly he reclaimed his home. First, the dust sheets came off the drawing room, then the great saloon. Windows were thrown open, furniture was waxed, and fresh air chased away the damp. Light was returning to Westbourne. Yet his injury remained an unyielding, permanent part of his daily life. His limits still brought bursts of frustration, but the old dark rage had faded into a quiet, grudging acceptance. He was learning to exist in the world as he was, and Edith knew he did it because she was there. Her steady, unblinking gaze gave him permission to be flawed. Slowly, their hours together grew. They walked for miles through the park, dogs running ahead while they debated books, estate business, and politics. He possessed a sharp, dry humor buried for 10 years that made her laugh. In return, she told him of her late husband, Arthur, her passion for medicine, and the quiet joy of solving a difficult diagnosis. She spoke of her past without regret, just a long road leading to this very place. She was falling in love. It did not strike like lightning, but arrived as a slow, quiet certainty, as natural as the changing season. She loved his sharp mind, his endurance, and the kindness he hid from the world. He looked at her as if she were the only anchor in his life, but his own heart remained a secret. He was a guarded man. He called her his friend, his eyes and ears. He leaned on her, but she dared not guess if his heart went further. He was a duke. She was his hired companion. The social divide was a vast chasm, and she would never be the one to cross it. Then came a crisp, bright afternoon in early March. He asked her to walk with him to the walled garden, the place where she had spent hours, reviving his grandmother's old roses. The garden was completely transformed. During the cold months, he had secretly hired extra help, and they had worked absolute wonders. The tangled beds were clean paths weeded, and fruit trees pruned. Even the dead-looking roses she had given up on were now covered in tiny, tight green buds of new life. They stood together in the center of this neat, promising space. "It is beautiful," Edith said softly. "Your grandmother would be pleased," she added. "She would?" William asked. But his eyes were not on the roses, they were fixed entirely on her. He stared, acknowledging her belief that care could heal anything. "You have been incredibly patient, Edith," he murmured. "I have loved seeing it bloom again," she replied, her pulse quickening under his gaze. "I was not talking about the flowers," he said softly. He took a step closer. He was so near she could trace the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. "For 10 years," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "I was a ghost. I haunted this estate and I haunted my own mind. I believed a life of shadows was all I had left. Then you arrived. You stepped right into my darkness, but you never tried to force me out. You simply lit a candle and waited. He reached out his hand, not to touch her, but to make a gesture. I am not the man I used to be, he said. The war claimed him. This, he glanced down at his pinned sleeve, is a part of me now. It will always be. I will never be whole in the way people expect. He looked directly into her eyes, exposing a raw vulnerability that stole her breath. But when I am with you, Edith, I do not feel broken. I feel seen, and I feel possible. He went quiet, as if those words had cost him his last bit of strength. Edith felt her chest tighten with emotion. He was offering her his absolute truth, the raw, unpolished reality of his soul. She knew she had to match his courage. "William," she said, keeping her voice steady. "When I look at you, I do not see a wounded duke," she said. "I do not see a broken man. I see the scholar who reads Tacitus in Latin. I see the man who has the quiet patience to fix a clock. I see the gentleman who stood in a crowded ballroom and faced down every whisper just because a friend asked him to. I see strength, honor, and deep kindness. I see the man I love." The words were out. They were the most terrifying, honest things she had ever uttered. She had laid her heart bare, with no idea if he could ever accept it. He stared, his face frozen. For one agonizing second, she feared she had made a terrible mistake, that she had crossed a line and ruined everything between them. But then slowly, his right hand rose. He cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was hesitant, incredibly gentle, as if he were holding something infinitely precious. "Edith," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. He leaned down and kissed her. It was not a passionate, demanding kiss, but one of deep tenderness and quiet homecoming. It was the physical proof of everything that had passed between them, in silence for months. It was a quiet pact. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright. "I do not know if I deserve your love," he said, "but I will spend every day trying to be worthy of it." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but they were born of pure joy. She had chosen him, and he had chosen her. In the peace of the blooming garden surrounded by new growth, their own future began. 1 year later, a letter rested on the polished mahogany of the breakfast table at Westbourne. Bright morning sun streamed through the tall windows, catching the gold of the ducal crest. It was addressed in an elegant flowing hand to Her Grace, the Duchess of Whitchurch. Edith slid the envelope open. Another invitation had arrived. The Ashworths, ever relentless in their social ambition, were hosting yet another grand ball. She smiled. A year ago, this letter would have felt like a declaration of war. Today it was just paper. She looked across the room. William sat opposite her, reviewing a report from his steward. The breakfast room, once so tense and silent, had become their comfortable refuge. He looked incredibly well. The haunted shadow was gone from his face, replaced by a calm, settled strength. He still wore his sharp, dark coats, his empty left sleeve pinned back with care. The arm was gone. The phantom aches still returned whenever the weather turned damp. War was still in him, a scar on both flesh and mind. Love had not magically cured him. Instead, it had created a safe space where he could live with his wounds. He looked up, catching her eye, and offered that rare, quiet half-smile meant only for her. Another summons from Lady Ashworth, he guessed. "Indeed," Edith said, folding the paper. "She requests the honor of our company. And what will Her Grace reply?" He asked, a teasing spark in his gray eyes. Edith tapped the card against the table. "Her Grace thinks she might actually enjoy a dance." William smiled, rising from his chair to walk around the table and stand right behind her. He placed his hand on her shoulder, his warmth cutting through the fabric of her gown. Together they looked out at the estate. The grounds were no longer a wild, overgrown mess, but a neat, beautiful garden. The house felt alive again, its windows clean, its heart beating steadily. They had found their own rhythm. A marriage built not on dramatic passion, but on quiet companionship, shared tasks, and deep, lasting respect. They had their books, their flowers, and quiet evenings by the hearth. Together they had built a world of order, light, and peace. William leaned down to kiss her temple. "Then we shall go," he said, his voice a warm murmur. "And this time I believe the Duke of Whitchurch might actually know the steps. Their quiet, dignified life is the perfect resolution. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from today, and subscribe so you never miss our next tale.